Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Hughes. I'm here to represent the Straight Talk for Government chapter. I'm the co-founder and CISO at Acquia and been doing public cyber sector security for almost 20 years, prior active duty Air Force, and was a Navy civilian, was a civilian with FedRAMP. I'll actually be joined today by Hassan Yassar. We'll be moderating the conversation. Hassan, if you'd like to introduce yourself real quick.
Absolutely. Thanks for Chris. And I'm Hassan Yassar. I'm from Carnegie Mellon University and part of Software Engineering Institute. I'm a technical director at the SCI and managing DevOps and DevSecOps group, agile groups, and serving many customers, including DoDs. And I'm also adjunct faculty member at the CMU and teaching software security course and also DevOps course since 2015. And happy to hear a lot of topic today on the Zero Trust. Excited.
And actually, we just had Dr. Spina join us as well from MITRE. So give me just a second. I'll let you guys introduce yourself. But just a quick overview. The Straight Talk for Government chapter is a new chapter affiliated with the DevOps Institute. And rather than being regional, like some of the chapters, we're going strictly virtual here and focusing on, the government public sector, whether that's federal, space, DoD, intelligence community, et cetera. So we're hoping to enable the government through our open community approach, with academia, industry, government, and as well as research organizations like MITRE and SEI, for example, who ironically enough are both on the conversation here with us today. And our topic today will be focusing around zero trust, what it is, why it's important, what it's not, and how to go about implementing it. And today we have really two great guests on the topic. We have Jason Garbis. Jason, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to folks?
Yes, thanks, Chris, and thanks for having me here today. So I'm Jason Garbis. I'm Chief Product Officer at a company called Appgate. We're a provider of zero trust network access solutions. I am also, so in that role, I have the opportunity to work with a lot of customers and prospective customers and really get a good view of the industry. I'm also co-chair of the Cloud Security Alliance working group on SDP and zero trust. And in that role, I really enjoy that because it's just very good intellectual discussions, lots of writing and research with folks around the world about zero trust and how we can make things better. So looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, definitely. How about you, Dr. Spina?
Yeah, hi. So I'm Mari Spina, and I do cybersecurity for MITRE. I actually lead the cloud security group. It's a capability area. We have a number of sponsors, government sponsors, mostly, it's all government that we support. And there's a lot of great stuff coming in zero trust now. It's kind of shaking up the industry. So good time to talk about it. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely agree there. It's definitely a massively interesting topic and one that's getting a ton of attention now, especially given the recent, activity around the executive order, memos and guidance out of the OMB, the White House, CISA, and others, So, first we want to kind of level set, not everyone has read the book, let alone wrote a book on zero trust. And there's many definitions of zero trust. So, for each of you, joining us, what would you say your definition of zero trust is? What exactly is? What is it? And is it an old concept with a new name? Or what's different about zero trust exactly when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, let me go because I think Jason can give you the more formal approach to that. I actually believe fundamentally it's just sort of a reiteration of really good security that we've been preaching for the last 25 years. As simple as you've got to monitor your users, you've got to make sure you're authenticating them. But maybe a twist on, hey, let's get the authorization down to a fine-grained access control, and let's continuously authenticate them. And, let's stop trusting some things. But, we shouldn't have trusted them in the beginning. So these really shouldn't be new concepts.
I view that, I view zero trust as, and it's unfortunately has turned into a marketing buzzword, but it really is building on the foundations and the things that Dr. Spina talked about of principle of least privilege and multi-factor authentication and role-based access control. Clearly those are all foundational principles of our industry and also of zero trust. So zero trust isn't taking a hard right turn or rejecting anything. It's really building on that. But more importantly, I think it's doing two things. One is it's recognizing that we have to enforce this principle of least privilege, not just at the identity or account level, but down at the network level. But we have to do that in a way that is contextual and identity aware. And that's really been a problem before, or a challenge, given the infrastructure and the technologies we're using. There's always been a gap between network firewalls. Even next-gen firewalls are all about IP addresses and ports. And really what we care about are identities and roles. And we haven't had a solution or even an architecture that's let us bridge this gap before. So what I think Zero Trust does is it kind of embraces that and says, okay, we need to have a holistic policy model across all our users and all our resources. We need to have these distributed policy enforcement points. And we need to have a system that embraces the need to integrate with these other elements of your ecosystem, your identity solution, of course, but also an endpoint management system or a SIM, other things like that, that really tie together and allow us to operate and enforce these policies that are really fine-grained, but also operate at speed and scale. And I'm sure we'll talk about DevOps today and some of the amazing ways that a Zero Trust approach can really accelerate and enable that.
I had a follow-on thinking as well, and Jason and Dr. Spina. There is a kind of a confusion term, and I'm hearing like there's a Zero Trust strategy, there's a Zero Trust architecture. I knew we were talking about Zero Trust. Can we really separate the terminologies, what the Zero Trust strategy means, what the Zero Trust architecture means?
Want me to try it first, Jason?
Sure thing. Go ahead, Dr. Spina.
So, I think when we think about strategy, we're talking about what is going to be the cybersecurity strategy of some organization or enterprise. And the government's given us a lot of really good sort of guidance. We've got pillars that came out of CISA. We've got a different sort of set of pillars that came out of NSA. And those are really good guiding principles to sort of give us these objectives in a maturity, life cycle maturity model that can help us to sort of plan over time our investments into various capabilities. So I would say once you've picked your capabilities and sort of have a time frame for laying them out and deploying them, you kind of have a strategy.
Excuse me, I'm muted. Yeah, I view Zero Trust as a security philosophy and a strategy. And that really underpins, okay, the principles or tenets of how do I need to approach this? And I think certainly NIST 800-207 does a great job of talking about the principles in there. And in that document, they do also talk about some architectures at a fairly high level in terms of deployment models. But really, we view Zero Trust as a journey that organizations need to take, and they need to choose what architecture and, of course, what tools ultimately they're going to use to accomplish that. But I think I'm certainly biased towards the software-defined perimeter architecture as a way of achieving that. That is an architecture promoted by the Cloud Security Alliance, this group that I'm co-chair of. It's an open architecture, and there's even within that, there's different deployment models, and of course, there's different vendors that actually have commercial or open source offerings that implement that. And I think that's one of the challenges is that there isn't and there can't be a single architecture that even the President of the United States can't say, your architecture has to look like this. We have so many different starting points and so many different organizations. And it's really interesting because you have some modern organizations that are maybe very cloud native. They don't even have any on-premises resources. And then you have the opposite where you've got older organizations, whether they're government or private sector. And of course, they've got data centers and they've got physical equipment in some cases. And it's impossible to come up with one architecture that covers all of that, but it is possible to come up with a philosophy and a set of principles and a set of hopefully a policy model and a set of tools that can be applied across those environments.
Yeah, I think that was a great distinction for both of you to make is, it is not one product, right? Or one architecture, for example. And on that note, is there anything when it comes to Zero Trust, are there certain core principles that you guys, want to emphasize that, policy agnostic or product agnostic, vendor agnostic? What are these core principles that really entail, Zero Trust?
Okay, you want to try it first again, Jason?
Okay, sure.
Okay.
So
okay, so I think there are some obvious ones, and then there are maybe not some obvious ones. So definitely fine-grained, least privilege access control is key, right? Meaning that, I mean, in the end, people and users and systems are only given access to other systems and resources and information that they need access to, right? It's almost that need to know concept. And, figuring out how to provide that fine-grained access control, it's not the same answer for everybody. So, for example, when we can get to the point where we're tagging our data based on the sensitivity, right? Or say what program it's related to and not letting a user get to it unless they're on that program. We can do a lot of that through applications, and an application front end can kind of control that. But what happens when the applications get ubiquitous, the data gets ubiquitous, and that access control gets a little more complicated? The point is we don't want to lose that fine-grained access control capability. But then the other thing is there's a lot of things we're trusting that we got to be worried about. So, for example, your federation service, right? We saw the federation service get compromised in the SolarWinds breach. And basically the systems in the cloud were then all, in trouble. And but our systems are set up to trust the federation service, right? So we got to look at those things we're really trusting, our key authorities, right? Our certificate signers, things like this within the organization that we're not used to relooking at. But what happens when you can't trust them, or when you're afraid to trust them, or when you're not sure? You got to really monitor, right? And you got to have people and eyes on the data. You got to be almost getting all the data. I mean, zero trust, I think, really requires full visibility. And so until you can get that full visibility and get eyes on it, and systems and AI ML hopefully can help us in the future. Not quite there yet, but we're sort of fingers crossed in that regard. I would say those are some of the key things that I would have people focus on at the moment.
Yeah, if you think about the kind of the fundamental key, the three core principles, they're around having a zero trust system that secures access for all users to all resources. And we really interpret that as no matter where the user is, no matter what device they're on, and no matter what type of technology the resource is, there needs to be a way for them to securely access everything. The second principle is about this dynamic and contextual or context-aware policy model that needs to look at the device attributes and the user attributes and the resources and the network and the overall threat landscape, and have a way to decide, okay, given all this, what should this identity, human or non-human, be allowed to access right now? And maybe they need to have additional step-up authentication, for example. And the third principle is around logging and monitoring all this traffic. And this can mean different things in different environments. In some cases, it might be appropriate to do deep packet inspection and look at everything. In other cases, it might just be looking at the metadata, and that might be enough around taking on the burden of introspection and storing the traffic and looking at that. And I think Dr. Spina brought up something interesting and certainly relevant this week with a breach of one of the major identity providers, and still unknown exactly what the boundaries of that were. But if your premise is, one of the premises of zero trust is assume breach. So, okay, that's a thought experiment, and it's interesting about, let's just say an end user's device gets breached, and you can kind of play that out. But what if it's your identity provider that gets breached? And I think that's a lot harder question. And it kind of, I think, leans into one of the ways that zero trust helps make organizations more resilient, which is tying together these other independent elements of your organization. So, okay, my identity provider gets breached. So now a user that's authenticating, and I really have no idea whether they're valid or not. And maybe they even have MFA because of the same identity provider. I've got to rely on some other attributes of geolocation or time of day or types of activities that they're doing that can all of a sudden become really, really important and might have to become actionable, right? I hit this big red alert button and now things get locked down if anything seems out of the ordinary.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. I think another great distinction you both made is it's not necessarily zero trust, it's zero implicit trust, right? It's getting a level of assurance of what's occurring and why and by whom, etc. Hassan, over to you. You want to take the next question?
Yeah, actually, I would like to unpack a couple of things. And Dr. Spina and Jason, you said it. Right? Data is important, which we are generating. Somehow we are generating data using applications or storing somewhere else. And also it depends on application context as well. When I really talk about the zero trust in either in a different settings on DevOps community, it's becoming kind of like a depend on an application layer as well. Like, I know there is a federated identity we have to use. We have to use the authentication mechanisms to authenticate an application. But sometimes it's becoming very problematic with the user perspective. Like user will be restricted. How are we going to resolve the conflict between what user is going to do their daily jobs, what applications offering what to do in terms of the roles and responsibility for their job, what they have to do. Now, we are monitoring that job. Like I see kind of like a problem with the user perspective, how we can overcome that usefulness the connectivities of the data user has to do their own job. Like it's kind of like a balance. We don't want to restrict a lot, but we don't want to open up a lot. Can you open up a little bit that topic? Like,
Yeah,
Really
so
see-
let me try first again. So I think you're talking about dynamic access control, and I think it is probably the one thing that the whole discussion on zero trust has really brought us that the industry hadn't really been thinking about. And it's the concept of, okay, suppose I want access to a system, right? But maybe I don't have all my credentials, right? Maybe I don't have my MFA. Maybe I only have my ID and password. Maybe I'm coming in at a different time than the system's used to. Maybe I'm coming in from a different IP address or even a different terminal. What do I do in terms of access control in that case? Do I give the user, say, potentially less access? And what does less access mean? Does it mean maybe they can just read the data but never write to it, right? Or maybe they can just share the data but not see it, right? For example, I mean, it's hard to answer that question because it's different for every enterprise. But along the lines of what we do in those cases, we're probably going to have to come up with some trust score, and this is where the NIST 800-207 document talks about the trust analytic, right? But still, industry doesn't know what the trust score is yet, right? Do I put weights on those authentication, on those credential concepts, right? Do I put a weight on where you're coming from, or the time of day, or the fact that you had MFA, right? Mm-hmm. And then use that somehow to control the degree of access that you have. That's the dynamic access. That's the holy grail. I don't think industry is quite there yet, but we really do need to try to get there. But let me give you a twist on that, and it's something that MITRE has been looking at. And once we get under control this dynamic access control concept, right, it's actually possible to use it to evade attack, right, in terms of if I see somebody coming in from a bad IP address or a wrong time of day, I can maybe shunt them to a honeypot and just watch them, right? So I can use it in deception, just as I might use it in access control to allow the users that I like to use my systems. So keep that in mind.
I love that. I love that use case, and it's I think it's an artifact of having that context, and that's definitely a sophisticated and advanced use case.
Yeah.
I think what Hassan is touching on is we've certainly seen enterprises who take a DevOps approach, and the way they're doing this is they try to make it as deterministic as possible, is to rely on the metadata for the workload. So you can imagine in a DevOps environment, we are constantly creating and destroying workloads, whether they're full stack infrastructure as a service or whether they're containers, but they all have metadata associated with them. And the beauty of a zero trust policy enforcement point is that it sits right next to these workloads and can look at the metadata. It can also detect the creation or destruction of those workloads. So imagine you have a workload and maybe a developer creates it because they got to test something out. But tags on that metadata would indicate to the system, oh, this is Sally Jones. She's a developer. She created this workload, so of course she's going to get access to it. And then if she moves it over to a QA status, maybe she would lose access, but people on the QA team will get access to it. And that can work both for user access to those workloads as well as workload access egressing to other systems. So you can imagine moving something from test to prod. Clearly, you'd want to shift the data resources that it could access, for example, from the test database to the prod database. And that's kind of one really interesting way that a zero trust system relying on metadata and having the right set of APIs for either pushing or receiving events can tie into and enable this really high velocity DevOps type environment.
I'm really eager to hear that the connection, Jason, specific for DevOps thinking, because there is you touch a very important elements, how things we are building. There is a kind of a great zero trust implementation, how things that we are building. Then other things you touch about API perspective. Now, let's take that concept, put in the application layer. Like when we look at the zero trust, again, we're looking for networking layer identity, but there is an application really working on top of it. Every application has the connection endpoints, which we have an API. So I think how they're communicating each other, what the data is sharing, where we are storing, Now, we have to really think about the zero trust in that level as well. And unfortunately, we always thinking zero trust in a networking layer. There's an architecture element goes in the application layer. If application is not sharing my data, as an example, as a log file, how can we monitor it? Or application is not really following the common authentication example for federated component, how can we use that? And how things we are building is important too, which is SolarWinds is a great example. And securing the infrastructure perspective, who's going to touch the keys? How are we going to store the keys as an example? How can we monitor those? I'm looking for two perspectives. One is the things that we are building, then the product will be used in the community in the zero trust perspective. Like any thoughts on the architectural design on the application that we are building? It's
you touch on
the application here.
You touch on something really interesting, which is, and this is definitely unexplored territory in the industry, which is how can our applications get access to and consume this zero trust context around, let's say, the user session? And we'll think of a really simple example, which is geolocation. You can easily imagine an application that manages data, and based on where the user is physically located, you want to hide or disallow data access. Like Dr. Spina said a few minutes ago, we don't have a standardized mechanism for doing that today, but you could, it's not a very large step for us to say, okay, there's going to be proprietary ways to do it, but we really want a standardized way for the application to say, oh, okay, this user is strongly authenticated and they're in Germany, so they can access this data. Oh, that user is in the United States. We have to obfuscate the data or not even allow them to access that. So that's, I think, just over the horizon for us in the industry about how we can do that.
Yeah, let me take a shot at that one too. So Jason mentioned software-defined perimeter, and Hassan, you sort of wrapped in DevSecOps, right? And so in a recent collaboration with the ATARC organization, we did a collaboration on Rapid ATO, where we actually put software-defined perimeter in front of an enclave that had both blue-green dev and production systems in it. And so essentially the dev system was sharing the same environment with the production system, but the access for users, developers, and admins, right, three different types of folks, had to be controlled. We found that the SDP, the Open SDP software we used was pretty good on that. It wasn't a complete test of it. But that was sort of one example of SDP controlling security at the edge, essentially. And it was really access control, right? It wasn't much else. We also found that OpenSDP had some TIC 3.0-like capabilities too. So I'll just urge folks to go to the paper and look at that. Yeah, so that's all I want to say on that.
Yeah, I did see that paper. It's very good. I also wanted to try to unpack something with you that Jason touched on with both of you guys. He talked about cloud, and he talked about the identity-centric nature of zero trust, right, and identity providers. We recently saw some headlines with a notable, identity provider, identity as a service provider that's cloud-based. Given the identity-centric nature and the ubiquitous use of cloud, how do we approach zero trust in that context? Because it's very complicated, when you take all those factors into play.
You want to try first, Jason?
Sure thing. I mean, it's the good news for us as an industry is there's some really well deployed and widely deployed standards around this, like SAML, for example, or OpenID Connect, and even LDAP. And that's really how we're seeing enterprises embrace that. In fact, there's many enterprises, I would say most have multiple identity providers. And one of the pieces of deploying a zero trust solution is saying, okay, we're not going to fight this. We're going to allow this group of users to authenticate using that SAML provider. And this group of users, they have to authenticate using their on-prem AD or LDAP provider for historical reasons. And what the zero trust solution allows you to do is to normalize that and to, regardless of how someone is authenticating, mapping the attributes to a common format and then having the same set of policies that apply to them so that, okay, Dr. Spina authenticates using this cloud-based SAML. I authenticate using the on-prem LDAP. The zero trust system still sees the same information about us in terms of group memberships and attributes, and the same set of policies apply. And that, even that one step can be a big step toward simplifying operations and streamlining things and making it easier for organizations to either live with multiple identity providers or have a more transparent way of, over time, retiring them without disrupting either the user experience or the access they have.
Yeah, let me play on the multiple identity providers. So in the cloud, boy, we have just an explosion in ICAM systems, right? We end up in a hybrid environment. We end up having our on-premise AD, right? We've got our Azure AD. We've got for example, the Amazon IAM. We've got Okta, who's working with, SASE solutions, right, to give us a federation approach. And so we do end up with these multiple identity providers. And so back to the fine-grained access control, right? It's all policy based, and now I have these multiple systems I've got to get that policy out to. Fundamentally, they can all be well secured. They're not always perfectly monitored, right? But I would contend if you have an identity service, be monitoring it. That's the first thing you want to be monitoring, and you want to be having high eyes on it all the time. But the next step is going to be this orchestration of a common, consistent enterprise policy across all those systems, right? So it's not only the IDPs, but in the future, it'll be your PDPs and PEPs, right? Or your SDP controller or your SDP gateway, whatever it is, you got to get those all to be consistent with your identity aware firewalls and all of your authorization policy objects that you have in AD. So this is going to be the challenge because we're not here yet. We've still got individual administrators, individual stovepipe organizations managing various segments, and keeping them together is going to be tough. I would suggest workflow solutions, right? Workflow solutions that would have a new user come on and roll those identities to the right places, right? So if I need an on-prem identity, I might need to have one in Okta, and I might need to have one in the cloud, right? And you want those roles and privileges all to sync up. So anyway, that would be a good place to focus.
If I could real quick, either one of you, for folks that don't know the terminology, you mentioned PDP and PEP. Either you want to give a quick, kind of summary of what that is exactly when in the relation to zero trust?
Jason, how about you take that one?
Okay, sure. So these are two of the functional elements that are core to zero trust, and NIST talks about those and define those terms. So the PDP is the policy decision point, and you can think of that as the brain of the system that has access to the policy database and assimilates or pulls together all the information about the identity as well as the environment and makes decisions about, okay, what should this identity have access to at this point in time, given everything that we know about them and the device they're running on. And that's logically at the center. And then you have a set of distributed policy enforcement points, which can be deployed across a really wide variety of environments and technologies. And they receive from the policy decision point instructions through some sort of control channel, logical control channel, that tell it, okay, we know about this identity, and this is what they should have access to, given the areas that you're protecting. And then the user, or the identity, I should say, gets a secure connection through that policy enforcement point to the target resource. And there's lots of different deployment models around those policy enforcement points, whether they're network-based gateways, whether they're embedded in a host, or even part of a logical application.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, awesome. I just wanted to summarize it for folks that didn't know the acronyms. You want to hop in there, Hassan, with another question?
Yeah, so I would like to continue discussion for the identity management perspective again. And when we look at identity and the policy, yes, we have to monitor those as an identity and policy. But when we look at the different identity management, like we may have a cloud as mixed with our AD, now we have a different type of, so how are we going to monitor, because each of the identity managements are managed different perspective. Like this, we have an AWS as a different identity management versus an Azure space versus in using the Active Directory control in our organizations. How are we going to really solve this connectivities? Like how are we going to monitor those? Because each of them have different implementation practices. Each of them have a different outputs. Any idea on this kind of different identities for different services?
Let me say a few things, Jason, and then you can have it. This is a very interesting issue, and so some things you have to trade. And one that bothers me is, do I put my identities in the cloud or give my authoritative identities to a cloud service provider, say like an Okta, or put them in the cloud like an Azure AD? some of the reasons that I see, for example, folks going to Okta, say, and I don't mean to promote a particular vendor, is just the sheer capability that they provide, right? The ability to know what phone someone's on, what geolocation they're coming from, and potentially other aspects of their device, right? And so that brings in a very zero trusty access control, fine grained access control capability, right? That you might not get with on-prem AD. By the same token, Azure AD is doing conditional access, right, and helping in the same way to bring that ability to look deeper into the user and what they're doing before allowing access. But I think in the end, right, we do have to look at how well can we monitor these systems. And I would say that some of the cloud services may be winning the battle over monitoring because they help us do the monitoring and they can get all the data. And sometimes they have their threat analytics on for us, right? So those are really good things to look at. What I do believe is that the on-premise ADs are not well monitored. They've never been well monitored. There's a lot of administrators with hands on them, but that doesn't mean they're looking at the event logs. So, all of the big breaches we've seen, recently had some indicator in the identity databases and logs, and we weren't catching them. So I still say this is the place we need to focus initially.
Honestly, I'm going to a little bit deeper dive in that topic, Spina. Like when we look at infrastructure pieces, we use a lot of tokenized configurations. We use a lot of identity configuration. There are a lot of story happened a couple of years ago. I'm sure you all heard that. If the infrastructure is scripted as kind of a code, and if it is not properly handled with authentication or the tokenized or the access management at that level, we are covering up highly, we are monitoring everything, but behind the scene, there's something's happening. We may not know about it. So how much we're going to go to the monitoring is really crucial here. Are we going to monitor of what? It depends on the availabilities of the authentication mechanisms that I'm hearing, like any level of monitoring that we can deeper in the identity, because it's really, again, we depend on what the services are offering for us. Any strategy you guys can follow up or the advice to the folks?
I think it's really dependent on where you're defining the trust boundary and where you're saying, okay, we believe or we trust this environment. So, for example, let's say you're using an infrastructure as a service environment, and you have a policy enforcement point that sits in front of a private network there. You could say pretty reasonably that, okay, we're going to trust that any workload that's running that environment is cool with us, right? Because the only way a workload could get created there is if one of our administrators creates it or our development environment pushes out there. And that's a very reasonable stance to take. On the other hand, you might say, well, what if our admin is compromised and some malicious actor puts a malicious workload up there, and now that workload has access to the peer workloads on there? That's also a very reasonable stance. And then how would you do that outside, just within an IAA system? You may not be able to distinguish that. So there probably needs to be, I would say, there definitely needs to be some kind of outside orthogonal system that performs some sort of validation of that, whether it's a process check or whether it's some sort of integrity check. Maybe there's some signatures, et cetera, around that. If you decide that's high enough risk and a high enough chance that you want to have some outside mechanism for that. Both those stances are reasonable. I think it depends on your risk model, your maturity, and honestly, where your organization is. If you still have open ports in the internet and you don't have MFA, for goodness sake, start with those things first.
Especially it's very getting challenging. I know we already witnessed during the COVID phases that people are using their own devices, sometimes connecting corporate network. They may have generating data for their own devices. How can we control those data is generated from their environments? It's another challenging, right? Which is, again, it's hard.
So let me go back to something Hassan said. So I moved to the cloud. I moved my identities to the cloud. Say I'm using Azure AD. Do I get enough insight and visibility, right? And that's always a concern when you go to the cloud. certainly if the cloud is doing it better than you can do on-prem, you should go ahead and pay the cloud to do it, right? That's generally how I feel, because the cost ratios end up working out okay for that. But there is a situation where if I don't have my own on-premise identity service, I can't really do all the logging. So for example, we saw, and I just love this SolarWinds, right? We saw where the Federation service was compromised, and they were essentially forging tokens and getting people who weren't real users access into enterprise systems, right? And what needs to be done in that case is an actual logging and detection that, okay, when a new account was created in the cloud, right, was it created because I wanted it to be created? Was it created at the right time, right? And so that's some of the monitoring. Some of those logs you can get, but the log that says my Amazon IAM just got a Federation token from this Federation service. Let me go back and ask the Federation service, did it really send it? Is that my service that sent it, right? You've got to put a lot of logs together. So you see this integration of logs so that you can make one story thread. And so I think when we make our decisions as to where to throw our identities and what ICAM services to use, we have to address those kind of issues. Do I get the visibility I need? I think it's a really good question, Hassan. And the cloud is not always the right answer.
You know,
Yeah,
I would argue that the cloud environments, because they have these very rich APIs, give you the opportunity to have, you know, much more reliable and deeper visibility. We think about the types of tools that are out there, cloud security posture management, or, you know, the major cloud service providers have these analytics tools. And that's a different world than you think of a traditional on-prem environment. And, you know, you think of the horror stories of, okay, you know, what's running on your network? Oh, I don't know. You know, there's stuff that's been running there for 10 years. And, you know, you don't have the level of visibility and discovery and integrity checks that you do in the cloud environment, which is one of its appeals.
Yeah, so I agree with you, Jason. You're right. The cloud does offer many benefits.
Yeah, I mean, we're all part of Cloud Security Alliance, all three of us. So obviously we're fans of cloud. I did want to touch on something. You talked about visibility, and there's been a lot of talk about different tooling and logging and aggregation and such. One thing I've run into so far in large organizations, and I'm sure you both have seen this, whether in the private sector, you know, on Jason's end, or in the government, federal, you know, within big federal agencies with Dr. Spina. You know, when it comes to zero trust, there's a lot of focus around holistically bringing all the tools together to give that, you know, enterprise-wide visibility. How do you deal with that when you have a lot of siloed tooling and different duplicative tech stacks? And, you know, how do you kind of move an organization in a direction to get that visibility that we're talking about when you have so much going on?
Yeah, it's a whole pillar, right, Jason?
It's a challenge. It's especially, you know, you're oftentimes dealing not just with technical silos, but, you know, political silos and people who may not want this. If you're fortunate, you have some top-down buy-in and ability to do this. And I think even if you do, or even if you don't, it's about building this, you know, this pathway one brick at a time of saying, okay, great. As a security leader in my organization, I understand, you know, there's friction or there's problems or there's a barrier here. Let me focus on that. And you do it in a way that even if it's 100 users to start with or one application, it's going to be starting to break down those silos and building these bridges, and not just technical bridges, but organizational bridges of helping this team or this business unit or this part of your department to improve their operations and improve the effectiveness of their mission. And that will engender some goodwill and momentum that you can do this, you know, team by team or application by application. I mean, clearly, the tools you choose need to be able to connect up and break down those barriers. And you also need to acknowledge that zero trust is not, you know, taking this old puzzle piece out and putting the new one, and that's exactly the same shape. There's going to be changes to the infrastructure, and you have to understand that. You can do it selectively, but it's not the case of you're doing a like-for-like replacement. Oh, I've got a NAC, I've got a VPN. I'll just swap that out for zero trust.
Yeah, I agree with all that. But I'm also a proponent of a living architecture. And I think that's could be a new concept for folks. I haven't necessarily been successful at building a living architecture, but an architecture that is out there sort of in the cyberspace of the organization, right, on the intranet, where engineers can go to it and see, where am I supposed to be headed? Giving people this sort of, giving engineers at least this sort of roadmap, a technology-based, capability-based, and a living thing that's updated and doesn't become, shelfware, and it's, it was published last year, we don't care about it now, everything has changed. But throwing those targets out there and giving folks, when they come up with new programs and new projects, something to target and to aim for, I think is, and then combined with a good champion, right, is probably, I say, the best you can do.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jason. I'm sorry.
Sorry, Dr. Spina. So are you thinking of a kind of a reference architecture, or something that's going to be specific to each organization?
Well, I think that the reference architectures that come out, we've seen CISA, NSA, NIST, all develop some kind of, and DoD, right? All develop some kind of reference architecture. I think reference architecture is a start. I think you have to bring it closer and closer and closer to the organization if you can. So sort of refining lower level details. If we can get there, we're doing good. If all we can get is a reference for the enterprise, I think that's key, right? Not this general government reference. Let's break it down into what it means to us. I continue to tell folks when they say, well, what are all the capabilities? Okay, here's the fan chart of zero trust capabilities. There's a lot of them, but what do they mean to you, right? I was working with one organization where MFA is only done for privileged users, for the admins, not general users, right? And they just don't want to put the burden on the general users. And so, we haven't really reckoned with the fact that zero trust may put an imposition on our users, right? I think Hassan hit it at one point. This continuous authentication, do I have to keep logging in every 10 minutes, right? Well, there are solutions for that, and some are better than others, but we're going to have to reconcile what that means.
Yeah,
that's really close. Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say definitely some great comments from both of you on the architecture front. And we've talked a lot about tooling and architecture and things like that. Just shifting a little bit, knowing that this is a government chapter of DevOps Institute, highly regulated environment, a lot of compliance. We all love compliance. I was reading the NSTAC recommendations to the president around zero trust. And one of those was to try to kind of bring harmony to compliance and zero trust efforts that the agencies are undertaking. Any thoughts around, the relationship between compliance and zero trust as organizations try to tackle, both these kind of responsibilities, and do they overlap? Do they not overlap? How do we kind of bring some harmony to that?
Jason, you first.
That's what's known as a hospital pass. So I think that these things are related, and that what zero trust, if it's done properly, does is it makes security and compliance a byproduct of operations, where the default deny, or the principle of least privilege, is if you're not supposed to have access to it, you don't have access to it. So there's no compliance issues with people having inappropriate access. Then it's about making sure you have the right policies set up and being able to demonstrate that, okay, this identity is authenticated, and the policies are, if they're in this group, they're allowed to get access to this. There's also an interesting angle around tying access to business processes, which I love this use case, which is tying a zero trust policy to a service desk. So the great example is a system administrator who on any given day has to log in and fix problems on 10 out of 1,000 servers. And of course, nobody knows which 10 on any given day, but the process that the organization puts in place is to create a service desk ticket. So what the zero trust system does is it ties into the service desk through some sort of integration, retrieves a set of open tickets assigned to this user, and says, okay, great, Sally's our system admin. She's got to fix a problem on server X on IP address Y, and it allows her to access that over the network and do her job. When she fixes it, she closes the ticket, and then that network access goes away. So the beauty of it is, even if Sally's malicious or gets compromised, she doesn't have access to all 1,000 servers, and she only has access to the handful that she needs. It forces her and the team to follow the business processes, which is what you want, and it's self-documenting from a compliance perspective. So I think these things all really mesh together, and there's going to be lots of other examples of by setting these policies and having these things run automatically based on attributes, or in this example, business processes, you can get away from the old school treadmill of manual firewall changes and then having to document that from a change management and compliance perspective. But no one wants to live that world anymore.
Mm. Yeah, I would have to say I really like Jason's sort of fine-grained use case in terms of user actions feeding some compliance record. That's really good. But for zero trust purposes in government, I've seen a lot of compliance being remaining a separate security activity, right? And one more focused on the CISA prescription for continuous monitoring and mitigation, right? Diagnostics and mitigation, CDM, where it becomes more of a scanning and logging concept, right? And so it's not a bad approach if you're doing something to the alerts, right? So when you find the bad piece of software, you find you're out of compliance, are you able to respond and do something with it? I think if we continue down that path and compliance is seen as its own practice, it's probably not bad. And I think it fits within zero trust at the moment. I don't think zero trust would have us to sway any differently. But I do like adding the concept that Jason just sort of revealed, that notion of, okay, every user click, right, acts on compliance in some way. So let's get that correlation. Good idea.
I want to open up another topic, interestingly, because we are talking about the monitoring. Are you always looking for the zero trust should really help us to be more proactive instead of being a reactive? Because usually when we look at the monitoring, we are trying to react something if it is not approved, if the user is doing something. Can we do anything as using a proactive mode? Try to plan something in advance if we can. I know AI is not there, as you said, Dr. Spina. I completely agree with you. Something we can really test those identities or policies in advance to see that are we really doing the good in terms of the response or the any unknown access. How are we going to test those capabilities, like being a more proactive perspective?
So let me go back to my trust analytic. The concept of the trust analytic is really, really powerful, right? Because you can look at all of these attributes on a user, on a system, on something wanting access, and use those attributes to assess your ability to trust it, right? A trust analytic or a trust score. I think that's where the answer is going to be. I mean, there's a lot of solutions to test. There's a lot of data to monitor. And what does that all mean? Can I see it? Can I build my threat detection analytics so it operates in an automated fashion? These are hard things to do. The threats are changing. I've got to continuously change the analytic. And oh, by the way, my systems are changing. So now the logs are changing. And when I have multiple clouds, all their logs come out different, right? So now I got to integrate different logs. So it might say a mess, right? We're going to be in business for a long time doing this, and that's one of the reasons why.
Yeah, given how complex it is, we got about 10 minutes left. I did want to give you guys each a chance to, given how complex it is, we realize it's a journey. There's no single solution, no single, right architecture, for example. There's no single vendor solution that'll fix all of this. What are some actionable steps if you're looking at this as an organization or an agency, as a security leader? Where do I start, right? Now, any recommendations for that?
Yes, I would say the best place to start is fine-grained access control. Get the attributes and the policy objects as fine-grained as you can so that you're providing fine-grained least privilege access control, whether you want to use ABAC, attribute-based, or RBAC, role-based. It doesn't matter. I think to some degree it'll depend on, if you're using AD, roles fit real nicely. If you're using Amazon, roles fit real nicely, right? And so, when you use ABAC or RBAC, I think should be up to you. If you can use them both, I'd have folks look at NJAC, Next Generation Access Control, coming out of NIST. It's an ANSI standard, and it looks to abstract the data. I think it's a little advanced, but just take a look at it maybe from a target perspective. And then certainly next, I would say go to the MFA, try to get a phishing resistant and verifier impersonation resistant MFA. They're not all resistant in those ways. So those would be the first two steps, I would say. Then the third, logging. Log everything. I hate to say it because I know it's going to be a nightmare. And then see if you can build your threat detection analytics. And then the future goal, look towards the trust score concept and analytics in that way.
Yeah, from my perspective, and everything that Dr. Spina said is a good way to start. Definitely take the time to do some research and reading, educate yourself on what zero trust means and what it means to you and your organization. There's lots of free resources that are out there. NIST 800-207 is great. There's other recent research and things that come out of both the Cloud Security Alliance and the government. And as you do that, think about, what does it mean to my organization? What does my journey look like? And then start to build bridges and connections to your peers inside the organization, not just the security team, because I think people on the security team are going to get interested and excited about this. It's people who might not be aware of it or not need to be educated on the benefits. So, kind of the first orbit around yourself as a security professional are people on the networking team and the identity team. But almost more importantly are people who are outside of that, whether they're in a business unit or an application owner, people responsible for different pieces of the mission. If you're in a government organization, get them on board, and not by explaining the technical parts of it, and maybe only a little by explaining, hey, we're going to be in a better world from a security perspective, but tying that to the improved user experience, the ability of the organization to achieve and accomplish its mission much more quickly and much more easily, whether it's moving certain things up to the cloud or better containing and better enabling for on-premises technologies and things like that. And really think strategically, but I would also encourage people to start small and not try to have your first project be rolled out to all 10,000 users in the organization. Start with 100. That's a great place to start. You'll learn, you're going to make some improvements, you'll win some allies in the organization, and then you'll be able to grow it from there.
Awesome. How about Hassan? Any final questions for these folks?
I have one thing I would like to add, and also the question as well. And Jason, you touched a couple of times about the organization risk. I think there should be another element, right, for organization risk. What really matters to us? We wouldn't want to be overcomplicated. We don't want to be over creating the work, but depends on what data, what the risks are. We're supposed to do. Any thoughts, any advice on the risks? Like with specific organizations, and then which driving the zero trust implementation based on organization risk, they have to deal about it. Maybe compliances, maybe the risk they have to based on the data, maybe they are the business risk associated. There's a direction or the communication in between.
Yeah, let me add. I know we're winding down. So, one thing that I'm helping a sponsor with at the moment is planning a zero trust adoption roadmap to be aligned with their threat-based risks, right? And so, so we're actually using something akin to the attack model, right? And going through the adversary TTPs and asking ourselves, one, from an as-is perspective, how good are our systems today against this attack? And then if we implement XYZ zero trust capability, how much better will it be? And then using those numbers, those ratios to sort of plan our investment, right? Plan our investment. And so you might say that that's an investment plan correlated to or aligned with the risk priorities. That's one way to do it. It's a complicated way and it takes a lot of time, right. But it's not a bad approach.
It is always like enough is enough. What does enough is enough means? How much money we're going to spend, how much in depth we will go, and how much risk we can tolerate, isn't it? That's what we're trying to do at the end of the day. That's, again, looking for that more attacker perspective.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And so we're winding down, as you said, and we're really appreciative of both of you coming on. For folks that want to follow you both and hear more from you, where can they find you guys? What are you up to these days? What are some key things to look out for?
You can get me at mspina@mitre.org. I never remember my phone number, so I won't give it to you.
Yeah, for me, you can find me on Twitter, Jason Garbis, and if you look up the Cloud Security Alliance, the Software Defined Perimeter and Zero Trust Working Group, you'll see our schedule of when we have our meetings, and we're always looking for additional participants and volunteers.
Yeah, definitely, it's a great group. I need to go read the 2.0 spec that we talked about earlier. Actually, I haven't read it yet. Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us, and thank you for Hassan for helping us co-moderate here, and thank you everyone for tuning in. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Nice job, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Hey, see you.